And I am recording this module sometime in the future after all the previous modules have been recorded, because the C# language is always evolving. And in this module, I want to cover any significant changes that may be impacting the code you write for this course. Early in this course, you might remember we wrote code that generated a null reference exception at runtime. We had a null reference exception because there was an uninitialized field inside of the book class. Now, one significant addition to the C# language is an addition that is designed to help prevent null reference exceptions at runtime. So this is a new feature that was added to the C# compiler that will allow us to work with what we call non-nullable reference types. And the C# compiler can now aggressively look through our programs to try to find places where we might have a null reference exception at runtime. So first, I want to show you how this feature works, and then I want to explore some of the settings that have to be in place for this feature to work. So let's go over to book.cs, and I'm using the code that I have at the end of the course. But in this code, there is still a grades field. So at the bottom of this class definition, I have a field named grades that is of type list of double. And up here in the constructor for this class, I'm going to comment out the line of code that initializes this field. So in the course, this is effectively the code we had. We were working with a class that included a field that was never initialized. There were no warnings or errors from the compiler, and when we ran the program crashed with a null reference exception. But now, if I have this uninitialized field, let me show you what happens if I do a .NET build. So keep in mind I'm using a preview version of the C#8 compiler and the .NET Core tools. So some things may change between the time I record this and the time you view the video. If there's anything significant, I plan on re-recording this module. But what I want to show you is running .NET build now produces a warning. So this is a warning, not an error message, but the warning is that the non-nullable field grades is uninitialized. So now the C# compiler is smart enough to detect this possible situation where I might have something go wrong, where I might be using grades because I've never initialized it and I've never assigned to it. And because of that, the C# compiler can issue another warning that grades will always have its default value, which is null. Now, if you've reached the point in the course where we talk about reference types and value types, then you know that when you have a field or a variable declared as a reference type, which list of double is, then that field or variable typically contains a reference or a pointer to an object in memory. But the null value means that this field or this variable does not point to any object. It doesn't refer to anything. And therefore, if I try to interact with that field or variable by doing something like grades.add and trying to invoke a member on an object instance, that's going to throw an exception because grades does not point to an object. That's just going to be an error and it's going to crash the program. On the other hand, if I restore this line of code, so I am now initializing grades in the constructor, I could also use this expression new list of double as a field initializer and just say grades equals new list of double. It would work there too. As long as I have that in place and I do a .NET build, the C# compiler can analyze my program and come back and say build succeeded. Now, I'm temporarily going to switch over into Visual Studio 2019, not because there are features that are only available in Visual Studio 2019, but because only Visual Studio 19, a preview currently, will be able to show some of these warnings in the editor as I type. Let's take line 10 of program.cs for example. This is very similar to the code that we wrote earlier in the course. I'm just using some of the new capabilities that don't become present until you reach the end of the course. But let's try to say that book equals and a null value. If I do a build now, either from the command line or here in Visual Studio, once again, I will receive a warning, and I'm going to point out again, it's a warning, not an error, that in this case, I'm converting a null literal or possible null value to a non-nullable type. So the real core feature that we're talking about in C# version 8 is that when I work with reference types, I can make them non-nullable by default. So that includes existing reference types that are built into the .NET framework, as well as custom reference types that I create, like book. So if I write a class definition, it's non-nullable by default. And the C# compiler can now analyze my program and tell me when I might be potentially assigning null or using something that is null. So you might notice on line 12, I also have a warning, and this is possible dereference of a null reference. So that's telling me you might be throwing a null reference exception on this line of code. Also, let's invoke the method enterGrades, which takes an object that implements the iBook interface, and I'm going to pass null to that method. And once again, the C# compiler can give me a warning that I cannot convert a null literal to a non-nullable reference. Now, by the time you watch this, if you're using tools that are already using the released version of the C# 8 compiler, or something released even later, this will be the default behavior. By default, reference types will be non-nullable. However, you can control this behavior by placing some flags into your csproj file. So remember, a csproj file is the project file. It's the file that contains all the settings about how to build and put together this project. And there's two settings in here that I want to call attention to. First of all, the language version setting. Notice I have my language version set to 8.0. That is to ensure that I'm using version 8 of the C# language. And then the next setting is the nullable context options. I want to enable nullable context options to have the behavior that I'm describing here, where I have non-nullable reference types. If this setting is not here, and this setting should be here if you're creating a brand new project using the latest tools, but if that setting is not there, this behavior goes away. So look at how all my warnings have disappeared. I can now legally assign null to my book variable, and I can invoke the method enter grades without a warning and passing along a null. Would I want to do that? Probably not, because at runtime this can only create problems. So I'm going to go back to the csproj file and hit Control-Z to undo my change, place that flag back in there, and the warnings will come back. So let's say you're writing a program where you really do want to use null values. Some people like to use null values to represent the absence of information. What happens, for example, if you want to represent a completely empty or non-existent book? Well, if that's really what you want to do, you can use a question mark to say that, actually, this book variable is a nullable reference type of book. So yes, I can place books into this variable, and I can say something like, I want a new in-memory book, and give it some name, and I can legally assign that object instance into my book variable, but I can also legally assign a null value and not receive a warning because I'm saying this variable is typed as something that can hold nulls. So the question mark will allow me to do that. Same thing with the iBook method. Let's say I implemented this method in a way that I check for nulls. So if someone does pass me a null value, I'm prepared to handle that. In that case, I can once again use the question mark and say, well, pass me a book or pass me null. I can work in either of those cases. Now, there are more subtleties to these non-nullable reference types, but the big picture here is that the designers of the C# language are trying to help you identify and eliminate a common source of errors in software over the years. That common source of errors being working with variables and fields that are not pointing to an actual object and getting a null reference exception. This feature should allow you to find potential places where that can happen and eliminate them. In this module, we looked at non-nullable reference types in C# version 8. And there's many other new features and areas of the C# language that I could talk about, but I'm going to leave it for the next module to give you some of the additional areas that you should explore by using other courses here at Pluralsight.